Hello listeners, this talk is in response to Rockwell, and it's actually part of a chain of responses that began with me making a response video to Frederick Hohenzollern, who asked me about Asians and their seeming lack of interest in hobbies. Rockwell responded beneath that video, and this talk is a response to his comments. So here is what he wrote to me. It all sounds so bizarre and robotic. If someone told me that their hobby was sleeping and eating, then I would think they had severe and crippling depression. I almost wish that I could experience a day inside of the mind of an Asian person, because I just can't even imagine how anyone could live like this without feeling like their entire life is one long prison sentence. I always assumed that whites and East Asians had a lot in common, but I think I can relate more to an African than I can relate to the kind of person who says that their hobby is sleeping. Do you think that any of this is connected to the suicide rates in some East Asian nations? I know I would start to think that jumping in front of a train would be a pretty appealing idea if I had to live a life like this. Well, thank you for those comments and questions, Rockwell. What I'm going to do is look at some of these points out of order. I'm going to try to address those that are easiest and quickest to respond to first. So the first of those is the topic of being able to relate to Africans. Maybe you can or could relate to Africans. I don't think I can or could. My previous experiences with such people have led me to believe so. I used to work with a number of Americans who were black and also one actual African, a Nigerian. I worked at a school where there were 8 foreign teachers here in Taiwan, and we had a fairly high turnover of staff. In the 2 years I was there, including me, 18 people left. So it was very high, the staff turnover. And there were a number of black people who worked there, and they ranged from being okay, though I didn't really socialize with them and I didn't really have anything in common with them, to being completely crazy. In the case of the Nigerian guy, he was a real character. He always had some scheme he was cooking up, and there was a white American guy there. And I don't know if any of you have noticed this phenomenon, but if you meet someone and you say, where are you from? If you meet someone who's not from America, they'll tell you the country. So they'll say Australia or Germany or France or something. But if you meet an American, they'll never say they're from America, or they'll never say they're from the USA. They'll always tell you the state or the city. It's just something they do. And this guy, the first time I met him, I said, where are you from? And he said, the USA. And I thought, that's a strange thing to say. And also he had a strange accent, but apparently he did have an American accent. I don't know how he did. But one of my white colleagues, an American guy, he used to say, there's nothing American about that guy. And you could tell as soon as you met him. But he was always cooking up some strange scheme. At one point, he had this scheme that he was going to return to Nigeria and start a mobile phone company. And he wanted this other guy and me to go and work for him over in Nigeria. And he wanted me to be his security chief. And I said, what the hell is that? Imagine me being a white security chief in Africa. I might as well just paint a big target on my back. And I said to him, I wouldn't take a bullet for you. I'm not going to take a bullet for you, man. It's not going to happen. But, he always had all these crazy ideas. And I just couldn't relate to him at all. And as I said, the others ranged from being sort of okay to being not quite as bad as that guy, but sort of annoying still. So I couldn't relate to those guys. I also traveled around the US twice. In the late 90s, I traveled around the US twice, primarily by Greyhound bus, which was, it was an experience. It was fun. It was a lot of fun. It was sort of a kind of a gonzo tour of the US in each case, being on these Greyhound buses, and all sorts of crazy things always happened. People who wanted to fight the bus drivers, and just just ridiculous things. People cracking onto each other, people screaming at each other. There was one guy once, he had gangrene in his leg, and all these people were taunting him. It was just insane. Every trip, there was always something that happened on every trip. It was funny. I mean, the first time I did it, I was 22. And the second time I was, I think, 23 or 24. It was fun and funny. I don't think I'd do it these days. But, I mean, I still couldn't relate to them. Yeah, so I don't know. Maybe that's probably all I'm going to say, really. I think if the choice is between being able to relate to Asian worker drones or African Dindus or Kangs, former Kangs, we was Kangs, to me that's kind of a Clayton's choice. I don't think I could do either, to be honest. And at least I'd probably be safer around the worker drone, the Asian worker drone, I think. So now I'm going to get on to actual Asians, talking about Asians. I'm going to somewhat play devil's advocate. I think sometimes I come off as being a little bit harsh about people here. I'm sort of a bit cynical about everyone, really, but I talk about Asians and I'm cynical about them also. So I'm going to somewhat play devil's advocate here, and eventually actually get on to talking about the West and so on, because I know that's a favourite talk or topic for most of my listeners. So firstly, not all Asian people are ant people. I think the relative percentages are probably higher here compared to the West. But I think that's largely to do with the fact that they don't have a welfare system. They don't generally have the same level of development. Certainly in Taiwan they don't, as many Western nations and so on. So people just have to work. It's really competitive here, studying and working, and so they do have to be ant people just to survive. And yeah, that does suck, and it probably is related to the high suicide rate here. I'm sure it is, actually, because a lot of people are under a lot of pressure. But they don't have any choice because they don't have a welfare system. That's primarily the difference. Now, on the topic of sleeping, sleep is one of those fundamental human needs, and I think like anything else, if you're hungry, all you can do is think about how hungry you are and how you want some food. Sleep is one of those things also. I think for people who are extremely sleep deprived because they're working or studying long hours, not necessarily efficiently, because a lot of the time people here just put in an appearance. They're not necessarily very productive, but they put in an appearance. But nevertheless, they still put in long hours, and so they're sleep deprived. And I think that's in that situation, of course, people are going to think about sleep. I know that when I'm sleep deprived, I don't really feel like reading philosophy or something like that. So I think that's understandable. The other thing I'll say about sleep is I've noticed that it's a real female thing. Men have their own forms of sloth or comfort seeking, but sleep seems to be a big thing for women, both here and in the West. Certainly here, for people who aren't massively sleep deprived, I've met very, very few guys who say that sleeping is one of their hobbies. But women, they love sleeping. And Western women too. My sister was like this when we were younger. I've had relationships with multiple women who have been like this. My wife is like this as well, actually. They could just sleep forever. I've met very few guys anywhere in the world who really like sleeping. Most of them seem to just want to get up and do stuff. And I'm no different. So I can't sleep more than about 8 hours. I just wake up naturally, unless I'm very sick. But women, they could sleep 14 or 16 hours straight if you let them. I think it's a female thing. I don't know why that is exactly. Maybe someone will offer a theory in the comments. Now, on the topic of eating in Asia, in East Asia at least, and certainly in Taiwan, is very much a social activity. It's not a solo activity, and it's not because of gluttony or that sort of thing. people here are actually a lot slimmer than in the West, so it's not a gluttony issue really. Um, it's very much a social activity. They don't like eating by themselves. They'll almost always eat with at least one other person, but the bigger the group, the better. It's very much a social thing. There'll be eating activities organised at work, and families, and everyone does it. It's a social activity. It's probably best to think of it more in the way that Mediterranean cultures regard eating. So, these long drawn out lunches and that kind of thing, with big groups. It's a social activity. Eating is not such a social activity in northwestern European cultures. I'm very Anglo-Saxon in this regard, actually. I eat really quickly. Everyone always says to me, "You eat really quickly," because I'll eat a meal in under 10 minutes, and because I just want to go and do something else, something productive. I very much see eating as being about nutrition and sustenance, and then I want to go and do other interesting things. And people remark about that all the time when I'm in Taiwan. Taiwanese do. If I go out with them, they take 3 hours to eat a meal. It drives me crazy. I eat in 10 or 15 minutes, and then I just want to go and do something else. And sometimes, if there's, sometimes you get these people who go on and on and on about Chinese food, and how wonderful it is, and so on. And that, sometimes they'll push their luck with me. And if I'm not feeling particularly charitable, I'll say something like, "Well, when your ancestors were out inventing another way to cook a bowl of noodles, mine were discovering continents and mountains and rivers and so on, and adding elements to the periodic table and curing weird diseases and so on and so forth. Would you prefer another way to cook a bowl of noodles, or would you prefer a cure for polio?" That kind of thing. That's a very Anglo-Saxon way of viewing the world, and that usually shuts them up. But it's a social activity, and also by extension, they love taking photos of food and putting it on Facebook, and putting the photos on Facebook and other social media outlets. And it sort of begs the philosophical question: if an Asian chick ate a bowl of noodles and she didn't put a photo on Facebook, did she really eat the bowl of noodles? But that's what they do, right? And that's because they're normies. That's what normies do. Normies participate within the broader culture, and the broader culture is usually pretty absurd when viewed from outside. But that's the whole point of culture, I guess, is that it's about rituals, and it's about social bonding and all of this sort of stuff. It doesn't have to make sense. If it has its own internal logic, it doesn't matter what outsiders think. So, that's just them being normies. Asians eating is just, in big groups and fussing over bowls of noodles. I mean, I'm sure I've often said to my wife or other Asians when they'll talk about, this bowl of noodles is so unique or something. I've often said, I reckon if you grabbed that bowl of noodles and you got one from another shop on the other side of the country and you did a blind taste test, you wouldn't know the difference, and they're like, "Oh no, I definitely would." I'm like, "Yeah, okay, whatever." But again, that's a sort of an Anglo-Saxon way of viewing things as well. But that's what normies do, right? They do normal things. And if we take a step back from Western culture and look at many of the normal things there, many of those are actually absurd, and I think they're actually more destructive than a lot of the normie things here. If you compare, say, a 19-year-old Taiwanese chick who just wants to go and put some photos of noodles on Facebook so someone will give her some likes and so on, contrast that with a 19-year-old Australian chick or some other Western chick. What do? They drink excessively, they take drugs, they engage in sexual promiscuity and all of this sort of stuff, and seek social approval for doing so. That's normie behavior for a 19-year-old in the West. I think the photos of bowls of noodles are actually a lot less absurd once you look at it like that. And even a lot of the sort of normie, middle-aged, middle-class activities in Australia and other Western countries leave me completely cold. I can't watch television or read newspapers or anything like that in Australia now. Whenever I go back, I'm lucky if I can watch a full 30 minutes of television. It drives me insane. I can't sit there and watch anything. I can't read more than about half a page of the newspaper. It drives me crazy because they're either always pushing the narrative, right? The degenerate leftist narrative, or it's mind-numbing crap. I feel like I need to self-lobotomize to get through it. So, I can't do that. It doesn't matter whether it's the news, lifestyle programs, sitcoms, you name it. I can't partake of any of that sort of stuff. And for a number of years now, I've felt it really difficult to engage normies in conversation. I mean, if it's someone who's very interesting and intelligent, I can talk to those people without a problem. I met several of my subscribers recently when I went to Australia, and I spoke to those guys for 4 or 5 hours each time, and I think we could have spoken for double or triple that time. But obviously we had to go and do other things. And I didn't have any problems about sustaining a conversation with those kinds of people. But the normal sort of conversations that my cousins have, or friends of friends, all of that sort of stuff, that they have, and I'm not talking about all the degenerate stuff here. I'm just talking about like real kind of normies here. Talking about the sports ball or the home renovations or careers or shopping or unimaginative family vacations, and I don't know, all of this sort of stuff. It just doesn't interest me, and I find myself really struggling to talk to these people. And every so often I really screw up when I talk to one of these people, because I start trying to talk about the things that I would find interesting, and they think I'm weird. I think I've mentioned this story before, but I'll tell it again. I think not last time, but I think it was the time before that, that I went to Australia. I was seeing a physiotherapist, and I had a number of sessions with him for about 30 minutes each time, and I think this was about the 5th session, and so we had exhausted all the usual topics of jobs and businesses and families and vacations and all this sort of stuff. And I just started asking him stuff that I was interested in, to see, if he knew about this stuff and what he thought. And I'd been reading all this crazy stuff. I think I'd been reading a lot of Zero Hedge at that time. And so I just started firing these off one after another. And so I said, what do you think about seasteading? What do you think about how China has proposed to build an alternative to the Panama Canal? They're going to build it through Nicaragua and connect all these lakes up with all these locks and so on. And what was the other one I asked him? Oh yeah, what do you think about China underreporting its gold stockpiles? It's just like all this insane stuff that's really interesting to me. And he was like, what? He'd never even heard of these things, right? And I was just like, oh yeah, no, I've screwed up here, haven't I? And so I can't talk to these guys, because I have all these weird things that I read online and talk to other people like me about, and then I get let out on de-release, and it's all hell breaks loose. I can't talk to normies, and they frustrate the hell out of me. They do. I feel like they're asleep. I feel like it's mental torture dealing with them, and I'll tell you another quick story. I've known Millennial Woes for, I think it's more than 4 years now. I knew him for a couple of years before he started his YouTube channel. And back then I still had a job. It was before I started my second business and quit my job. And I used to deal with a whole bunch of normies who were over here teaching English. And we used to have meetings periodically, and I would always come away extremely depressed and really frustrated or angry. And I'd rant to him about these things that had happened in these meetings. And There was one time, this was pretty much the straw that broke the camel's back. I had already decided to leave at this point. I don't think I had told anyone, but I had already decided to leave. But we were talking about the next contract that people were going to sign. And I had done a whole lot of calculations, and I had come to the conclusion that these guys were going to get screwed in the next contract. So I tried to explain all of these figures I'd done, and how these guys were going to get screwed. And they actually said to me, well, we don't want to talk about this stuff. We just want to have fun. We just want to relax in these meetings. And I looked at them and thought, what the hell are you guys doing? I mean, I'm not going off on one of my usual rants about, pedagogical theory or something. I'm actually trying to explain to you guys that you guys are going to get screwed out of money here. I would have thought that would be a relevant topic to you, but they didn't care. One guy came to me afterwards and said he was interested in me explaining it to him more, but the others actually said to me that they didn't care. So I used to come away from these meetings and I was always frustrated and angry or really depressed. And actually, in the end, I just told the guy who was in charge of the whole situation that I wasn't going to go. I made up an excuse about how I was doing. I had some other stuff on at work and I couldn't attend these meetings because they were at another location. And so I just got out of attending them because I used to dread them. I knew when they were coming up because they were about once every 1 or 2 months. And I knew ahead of time when they were coming up. And for the few days before these meetings, I'd get really upset. I'd get really depressed in anticipation of how bad they were going to be. And then on the way home from the meetings, I'd be completely despondent. And then I'd go online, I'd talk to Millennial Woes, and he'd say, dude, just relax, you're taking it too seriously. You can't do anything about this. And he was right, of course. But it used to really wind me up. But, that's what happens when people like me are around normies. And so, the solution is not to be around normies, basically. And so what I'm getting at here is that, yeah, I can completely understand why some Asians do commit suicide because they can't take it. They can't take this unrelenting pressure to compete and to just do some mind-numbing job or study some stuff that doesn't mean anything and have no life or no family outside of work and all of that sort of stuff. And if I had to choose between being around a bunch of Asian normies and living that lifestyle, or being around a bunch of Western normies and living that lifestyle, again, it's kind of a Clayton's choice. Okay, one is probably somewhat better than the other, but that's sort of like saying, would you rather I hit you with a baseball bat or an axe? I'd prefer neither, actually. But that's normies, right? That's normies. And as I said, the solution is not to be a normie and it's not to be around normies. And that's why I left and started working for myself, and I'm infinitely happier now. But you can't worry about these guys too much because, yeah, they look like they're wasting their lives and so on. But society couldn't exist without people who got up every day and commuted and then went to a job and did some paper shuffling and then commuted home and shopped and watched TV and did all of that stuff. If there weren't people like that, it would be some sort of Fight Club-esque scenario with people like me saying this is bollocks, let's just burn it all down, right? That's what would happen, right? You'd have a bunch of maniacs like me running around doing that, right? So yeah, it is kind of like a prison sentence or a lobotomy, but the solution is just not to put yourself in that situation. If you're like me, I don't know, I've probably just offended a whole bunch of normies. So I don't think you guys are normies. I think anyone who's on the alt-right by definition is completely out of his mind also, at least to normies. We don't think that, but they do. And what I'm getting to here is a sort of a series of broader points. Someone recently said to me on my channel, in one of the comments, he wrote that based upon the videos I make, it sounds like I don't have a very high opinion of Taiwanese, yet I still live in Taiwan. And I basically said, I'm a reactionary, right? I'm a sort of a grumpy old man, complaining about everyone and everything, and it's not as good as it could have been, or was, or should have been. I'm a reactionary, hence the name of this YouTube channel. One of the overarching themes of my channel is that modernity is destroying everyone in developed nations. There are local variations upon that. There's a local spin in each place. But ultimately, everyone is being eaten alive. Even the normies, they don't realize it, but they're being eaten alive as well. And everyone is kind of getting to the same point. They're coming from different directions, but they're all converging upon the same point. They're all converging upon a point of low fertility rates. I mean, it doesn't matter where they are. The East Asian fertility rates, as I have mentioned many times before, are pretty atrocious, but so are the fertility rates in many European nations. And, whether they're paused Western European nations or not paused Eastern European nations like Poland or Hungary, they have very low fertility rates also. And even if you look at countries in the Anglosphere that have higher fertility rates, once you take immigrants out, and once you sort of isolate the smart people, the well-educated people living in the middle of the city, those people probably, they wouldn't have fertility rates any different to people in East Asia, I think, if you looked at those people. So, everyone's converging upon that. Everyone's converging upon a point where they're getting bogged down in dysgenics, and at some point a lot of these societies simply won't be able to function, because whether they're importing a bunch of morons from the third world, or whether they're breeding up their own local versions of those people, or not quite as bad, but still people who are not very smart and who are going, have extremely high time preference and all the rest of it, they're all going to get dragged down by these incredibly dysgenic trends. Everyone is converging upon this Keynesian economic nightmare where they're running up massive amounts of debt, and they're all under the illusion that they're going to grow their way out of it. It's not going to happen, of course, and the particular way they solve that is going to be really interesting, because there are a number of options they could take, and I won't go into them now, but they're all bad options. But they're living in this fantasy land, and there's this mountain of debt out there. They're all converging upon certainly upon ZIRP, zero interest rate policy, if not NIRP. Now many of them are on negative interest rate policy, and those things are going to be devastating. Everyone in the developed world is converging upon all of these things, and there are a whole bunch of other things you could point out also. But everyone seems to be converging upon these things. And people in developed nations can only get away with the illusion of not living like ant people for now, because as individuals or as families or as societies, they have built up cultural and social and economic capital over previous generations. So there are a lot of people out there in the West who appear to be interesting. They have hobbies and so on. Frequently they're very degenerate hobbies. There are all these SJWs and NEETs and so on out there who have hobbies. But they're only able to do those things because their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents and so on built up all of this social and cultural and economic capital. And that's what allows them to be able to do those things. A country like Taiwan doesn't have this seed corn to eat that the West is eating, though it is eating its seed corn just like everywhere else. It has far less seed corn to eat because they've only been somewhat developed for a couple of generations, whereas the West has been in that position for several generations longer. So they have more seed corn to eat, though everyone seems to be eating all of their seed corn pretty quickly at this point. But they can't do that, right? Because there isn't a welfare system. They they don't have generations of infrastructure and all of this other stuff built up. There's been gross poverty within living memory in Taiwan, and so they can get away with less degeneracy, and they have to be ant people simply because they don't have any alternative. The West has alternatives, though. For how much longer? That's the big question. What happens when the money runs out? What happens when the previously august institutions of the West become completely degraded? I mean, they're getting there now. They're not there yet, but they're getting there. What happens when these things take place, when they reach their logical conclusion? I mean, show me a Westerner now, a young Westerner who is not a degenerate. Show me someone who hasn't been paused, who hasn't been completely dislocated and torn apart and so on by all of these trends. Extrapolate these people out. So extrapolate all of these SJWs and NEETs and so on in Western society. Even imagine just for a moment that there were no immigration and all of that sort of stuff, and you just extrapolated out to when these people who are currently, say, millennials, when they are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, those decades in which they really come into their own, or people would normally come into their own in terms of their careers or positions of power and influence and so on and so forth, right? What happens when all of those people are in charge, when they're running the show in the West? Where is the seed corn going to be then? Because they won't be replenishing it. They will have eaten most of it, if not all of it by then, and they won't be replenishing anything. These people, how are they going to handle being in charge and being responsible? How many of these people read books? How many of them know anything? How many of them can even compose a sentence that is grammatically correct and so on and so forth? These people, if they have children, and many of them will not, they will not be middle class culturally. They won't have the same set of influences to nurture them intellectually. And a large part of that is because they won't have the financial ability to have those things, because being middle class culturally often requires a certain level of wealth, also middle class wealth, and it also requires the society to be like that in order to provide the institutions to allow people to become middle class. Well, these people are not going to be in that situation. They're going to be complete dullards. They're going to oscillate between drudgery and complete frivolity. But they're going to be forced to become ant people also, because they won't have that cushion anymore. They'll have to just work or die, essentially, and because they'll be under this sort of oppressive drudgery all the time, when they do have spare time or money, they will just blow it on frivolous stuff also. That's the future of the West, and we can actually see that in sort of as a microcosm of that, with the children of people who dropped out of society in the 1970s to live in communes and all of that sort of stuff. So a lot of those people's kids have now grown up. They're about my age. These guys are uneducated feral idiots who are either on welfare, engaged in criminal activity, or working menial jobs, or all three. And those people, their lives suck also. All those people are concerned about is getting through their ant person job and then blowing their time and money on crap also. So that's where the West is headed also. And I guess one of the takeaways I'd like people to receive from this talk is that I don't think Westerners can really crow about Asian ant people. I mean, I wouldn't want to be an Asian ant person either, but similar sorts of things, or even worse sorts of things, are coming to the West for many people. And for me, if I had to choose between where a lot of people in the West are now at swimming in debt, and lots of them are stressed as well. Or those who aren't doing that and are sort of dropping out, becoming NEETs or SJWs or all this sort of stuff, man, those guys are going to get crushed. They are going to be absolutely destroyed within the next couple of decades by what's coming in terms of social and economic and technological changes. And so all of this is kind of a very long way for me to reiterate another of my most recent videos. I think the previous one to this, or the one before that, when I talked about people on the alt-right needing to get their acts together because the choices for them are going to be being an ant person or really being screwed in the future. That cushion, all of those reserves of social capital, cultural capital, economic capital that exist currently in the West, that have been built up for many generations, those are rapidly disappearing, and everyone else is going to have a pretty hard choice pretty soon, within the next decade or two. I would like to think that some of my subscribers will not be forced to make that choice between being an ant person or literally living on the streets, that kind of thing, because to me that's a Clayton's choice as well. So that's just something to think about. So that's the end of the talk. Rockwell, I hope this has been interesting. I know it went off on a quite different tangent, but I think a lot of people, they might be somewhat interested in Asians and Asia, but broadly speaking, most Westerners are interested in the West. And so I try to relate these things back to the West and how I think we can at times learn from some of these things, or that we shouldn't engage in too much self-congratulation compared to other people. Not that you were necessarily doing that, but I think it's very easy for us to forget that the West has many of its own problems. So to everyone else, thank you also for your comments and questions, Rockwell. And to everyone else, as always, please comment beneath this talk, and I thank you for listening as well.